All right, so if you'll recall from last week, we were in chapter 5 and we got through most of it, but there were a couple points really in the last section, verses 19 through the end of the chapter and verse 25, that I wanted to touch on so that we can move on into chapter 6. But if you recall, we talked about accusations against elders. First, we talked about honoring widows, taking care of them, the church's responsibility, familial responsibility, and then he made some points about elders who rule well and what they deserve. And again, it comes back to we talked about the idea of honoring them, and that means having an estimation or esteeming them, an estimation of their value, where we treat them like that. And that goes into how we support them. We talked about widows indeed who don't have people to support them, who are destitute and faithful, that the church has an obligation to them. And then he talks about how to deal with elders who have a problem. And he goes back to the old law in terms of the principle of multiple witnesses, and beginning in verse 19, he says, "Don't accept an accusation against an elder unless it's supported by 2 or 3 witnesses." And then he goes on, what do you do with elders who continue in sin? Publicly rebuke those who sin so that the rest will also be afraid. And I think that's, there's 2 things that we're looking at here. Number one is how do you deal with an accusation against an elder? It's not like I think we mentioned last week. You have one person, and we go looking for people to also join in, but it's about witnesses. It's about making this something that other people, not just one person, has brought to you. But then he also then talks about publicly rebuking, and the version I just read, the Holman says, publicly rebuke those who sin. But the idea here is if we go back into where that word comes from and this phrase is the idea of continuing in sin. Somebody who is an elder who is continuing to live that way or continuously engaging in sinful practice. And so, I don't think what he's saying here is that any thing that, when an elder sins, that we have some sort of public rebuke. I think what he's talking about here is when, you followed the standard for the accusations, and then you have some elder who continues to live that way. And he gives a reason for it. What's the reason for doing it publicly? Right, so that others may fear. And remember, again, Paul is writing this to Timothy because he's dealing with certain problems, and he's dealing with everything in this book that we've read to this point has been dealing with the proper order, the proper honor due different positions, the proper respect that we're to have and how we're to behave. And I think this goes in line with that because he's telling Timothy, you've got a difficult job to go do. And he's giving him the authority that he needs to handle these problems. And so we see here that there's a reason for rebuking an elder. If you don't rebuking an elder publicly, if you don't rebuke an elder publicly, if you were just to kind of deal with this and sweep it under the rug, what do you think the perception would be among the congregation? It doesn't matter, or are the elders treated differently than I would be if I was continuing in sin? I think that we see kind of the practical side of it too, because the point that I think he's going to continue into chapter 6 is that nobody is above the gospel. Nobody is got their own set of rules. Nobody's got their own set of kind of the way that you handle them. We need to publicly rebuke others as well when they're living a certain way, continuing in sin. And so the elders are no different. And I think that that when, if we have to do something public for one of our brethren, not only is it difficult, but it has to be done a certain way. And so here he's laying out how it's done when you're dealing with elders. And I think there is a certain amount of, institutional integrity that he's putting out there too, is that, hey, you deal with them like this so that everybody else can fear. And I think we learn from that too, I'm not an elder. But if I'm sitting in the audience and something like this happens, if I'm a member of the congregation, why would I fear that? Because if you'll make an example of an elder and apply God's law to them, certainly it's going to apply to me, okay? And so I can't excuse my own sin because I say, well, the elders live like this, or anything like that. So I think there's some practicality there as well, and how elders are perceived within the congregation. All right, so then he goes on, and he's got some admonition to Timothy as a minister, and so he gives him another charge. He says, I solemnly charge you before God and Christ Jesus and the elect angels to observe these things without prejudice, doing nothing out of favoritism. And I think that goes along with the, apply this without showing favorites, without, elevating somebody to a place that kind of makes them, again, above the law, we might say, or above the gospel. The Greek that's here means to make a solemn affirmation, to make a solemn and earnest charge. And so it is a little bit different, or it's different than the charge he gave in chapter 1, 9 and verse 18 as well. He's pointing out here, too, that Timothy has been entrusted, and he's going to I think, come back to that here in chapter 6. But Paul had entrusted Timothy with a certain responsibility and obligation by sending him there. Okay, and so he'd send him there to do these things, and primarily, to root out the false teachers, but ultimately to keep the doctrine of Christ sound. We talked a lot in the first weeks of this about the necessity of having sound doctrine and preserving it, and I think these thoughts continue as he closes out this letter in here, and then also as he gets into the end of the chapter. All right, so, and I think too, the other thing about this charge is that you kind of can summarize the whole book underneath this, and that's the things I've given you to do were keep doctrine sound, employ the right organization, the right structure, so that, and again, it's always going to go back to, I write these things that Paul told Timothy, I'm writing you these things so that people ought to know how to behave in the house of God. And so, whether that's putting, the congregation there, reminding them of the dangers of worldliness, dealing with the false teachers there, not allowing the church to be burdened with what we talked about last week, the financial support of widows, and even to the point of publicly rebuking elders as necessary. All right, so, and then he warns him not to make hasty decisions or recommendations. Don't get caught up in hastily appointing elders. Don't get caught up in the rush to rebuke an elder publicly. I think there's a lot of practical takeaways from this as well. But really, don't be too quick to appoint anyone as an elder. And he in verse 24, if you kind of jump down, I think part of that is what he's saying there is some people's sins are obvious, going before them to judgment, but the sins of others surface later. And the idea is if we're too quick to appoint elders and we don't know who they are, we don't know, it's not just about, I think when we talked about elders and their qualifications, we talked about not being a novice. That's kind of that other part of that equation, right, where they're not new to the faith, they're not, the idea of being an elder is older. And also, though, the appointment itself, the consideration and all that shouldn't be too hasty, shouldn't be too quick. And I think we see that one of the things that you see from that is that we want that to be because, we know and we understand them and know who they are. He has a little bit of counsel here for an ailment that Timothy has. And so he says in verse 23, don't continue drinking only water, but use a little wine because of your stomach and your frequent illness. And so there's a lot said about this verse. Why is it here? What's it doing kind of right here? What was Paul getting at? Why did he wait till this chapter? Well, he didn't write it in chapters. He wrote a letter. And so I think that we could get into a lot of things here, and I think the thing that we're going to do this morning at least is we're going to look at this for really what he's saying here, and I think the first thing is, we know what he said about alcohol dealing with elders and deacons, and then he comes down here and he mentions this to Timothy, talking about, as Timothy goes and does his work, and then it's almost like he inserts this here. I think what we can see here is that, we've talked about in the past how God is concerned with the perception of his people, inside and outside the church. I don't know what the cause of Timothy's problem was. I don't know if it was because of the water. I don't know if he was only drinking water because he didn't want to appear that way. It doesn't say. What we do know is that there was something bothering his stomach, and Paul is endorsing the medicinal use of alcohol or of wine in this case. And so this is clearly not, drink it socially just because it's going to help prevent your stomach. It's use it medicinally, and it's not anything other than use this to help alleviate that. And so, I can't find anything in here that makes it condone social use of alcohol. And so I think what we need to do is look at it for what it says and only do that. All right, and then we already mentioned verse 24, but he does have this reminder here at the end of the chapter about good works and people's sin and the way that we live our lives. Eventually will make our hearts known to others around us. And we can certainly make a lot of determinations about the people that we know and that we're involved with by how they conduct themselves. All right. And I think there's a final point here too, that this kind of this end part, there's nothing, random about this wrapping up the end of this section. I think Paul is reminding Timothy about his influence. I think he's reminding about his place among the people of God. And I think that one of the things that comes to mind for me when I'm looking at this kind of in its entirety is a way to remind Timothy that his integrity is important. And I thought of Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 9 says, whoever walks in integrity walks securely, but he who makes his ways crooked will be found out. And so if it was maybe the perception that Timothy was concerned about for him not drinking any wine at all, I think that would fit there, that he's reminding him that you're a man of integrity, and he's going to kind of elaborate on Timothy as a man of God. And I think there's a takeaway for us there that if you look at the qualities that he's talked to Timothy about is, maintaining who you are and your commitment to the gospel. All right, I know I rushed through that section. Does anybody have any comments on this or chapter 5 before we move on? Yes, ma'am.
It sounds also like, when you take something for a medicinal purpose, it's usually taken at home. You don't go out with a jug over your shoulder saying, I'm going to drink this because my stomach hurts. We do things in the proper way, and I think that's what another thing that's implied here is it's for medicinal reasons, so you're not going to go out and party with the wine.
Yeah, I mean, I think, he's endorsing a particular use case for it. All right. Any other comments? All right, so let's move on to chapter 6. All right, so another relationship is what he's dealing with. And I think one of the things that you see, again, we mentioned this before, but the way that the letter is structured and how it, in our Bibles is not necessarily the way that we always see it, or the way that it was seen back, when Paul wrote it and when Timothy read it. And so, even though we're beginning a new chapter, I think there's part of this that is part of a bigger picture. And really, it has to do with this idea of who we honor and our relationships inside and outside the faith. And so, particularly, you see this kind of progression, and you see this honoring of widows. And if you think about that in terms of the widows being the most vulnerable of our brethren, and how we are to care for them and how we're to perceive them, and we get this idea of what our obligation is to them because they're our sisters. And so that progresses into how we're supposed to honor the people who've been entrusted with the most serious and grave of our lives, which is our souls, and that is our elders. How are we supposed to esteem their value? How are we supposed to think of them, talk to them, act towards them, demonstrate to others what we think of them? How are we supposed to conduct ourselves about that? And he has this idea of double honor, that elders who rule well are worthy of double honor, of even more than that. And we talked about how that could mean elders who are preaching and teaching, and the financial support that goes with them. And we didn't touch on it, but when we think about this idea of what we honor, we also sometimes will say, what do we really value? Do we value our elders to the point that we look at it as a financial obligation? Or is it just something that they're just expected to do? We talked about, you don't muzzle the ox who's laboring. But I do think whether or not we financially support them or that they need financial support, we should, in our minds, value what they do. And we should value our widows and our vulnerable brethren. We should really value those who are entrusted with such serious matters, like our elders in this case. And then he comes back, and now we have this idea and this other relationship about all honor due somebody else. And so I think there's a progression of how much honor that we're given, and we see examples of honoring people even outside of the faith that we're required to do as Christians, particularly if we as we talked about last week, honoring the king, honoring the emperor. And as Christians, we're expected to do that. And so in verses 1 and 2, he's dealing with this idea of this relationship between a master and a servant, a master and a slave, or a master and a bondservant. And a lot of translations use the word here, slave, and it's an appropriate use of the word. Some use servant and some use bondservant. I think it is important to just for a second look at it and go, what kind of position would this have really been? And I think it applies to all of them, because the point is, how does that person regard the person over them? And so, this isn't necessarily a passage about slavery and its merits and I don't mean merit. It's the lack of merit for slavery. It's not a passage that we go to show why slavery would be a sin for a Christian to engage in. This is simply about people in that relationship and what they're to do, how they're to act. And I think we can point to several verses. Particularly, we can go back to chapter 1 and verse 10. And one of the things that he talks about the evildoers doing is kidnapping, and it comes from that same word. Sometimes it's translated enslavers. And so there is a different kind. There is a type that would be prohibited. But there's also Christians that found themselves commonly in the first century in a relationship of being a bondservant, particularly, having to work off a debt, working for a master because they owed him something, and they needed to fulfill that obligation. And so he says, all who are under the yoke as slaves must regard their own masters to be worthy of all respect or all honor, so that God's name and his teaching will not be blasphemed. Gives them a reason. Again, I think it's going back to how do the people around you as a Christian view the way you live your life and what God expects of his people. And so I think in here what we see is that that relationship requires us, because of their position, if we're in that situation, that we must honor them. We must conduct ourselves a certain way. I didn't even change the slides. So they regardless of the spiritual status of the master, they are bondservants. Slaves are supposed to regard their masters with all honor. And then he even gives the scenario where the master is a believer. And so what might be the tendency if your master is a fellow brother? What might that do to your attitude as the person who's under them?
You might be more, perhaps less inclined to obey him and follow him.
Yeah, you might be right. You might be less inclined to be concerned or to obey them, and certainly you could take on it would be, I think we can understand it'd be pretty easy to take on the attitude of, oh, well, I'm working for a Christian, and so maybe they don't expect that of me. But what is the reality? What does he tell them? No, you need to do what? Serve them all the more, right? And if you think about it, I think it goes in line with that idea that we have an obligation to honor those in authority. And if we disregard somebody just because of our relationship in Jesus with them, if we maybe don't expect to work as hard for them, or we expect preferential treatment, you can see quickly how we might be undermining our own integrity with other people that we're trying to teach. And so he tells them, you should serve them better, since those who benefit from their service are believers and dearly loved. You should want to work harder for them because you're benefiting somebody who's your brother, and so it goes hand in hand with this idea of why we should serve one another, because we should be more eager, I think, to serve each other because it directly benefits brothers and sisters. And you see that heart throughout, a congregation like this, where you see people who do a lot for each other that never even goes announced and made public. But you see it. If you're around here long enough, you see it. You don't see all of it, but you see it. You hear about it. You know about it. And so you start to understand that, first off, there's some people that do it a whole lot more than others. And I think we all probably have a couple of those people in our minds about how they tirelessly work to help others behind the scenes in this congregation. And you can see what that does for yourself when you understand that there's people doing that. And we certainly know that when we help others and when we work hard for our brothers and sisters, we know what comes from that. And so here he's just pointing out that you need to work harder for them because they are your brothers and sisters, and it's to their benefit. All right, so this next section, he deals with, and this is, and I say the next section, this is kind of everything together, and then we're going to break it up. But there's several things that we see him doing here, and so I think it's interesting to point out that it's very similar to how he opened this letter. That he started by sending Timothy and addressing false teachers. That he encouraged him, gave him instructions to fight against it, and then ended that first part with a blessing as well. And so he closes it in very similar fashion. And I think that's important to note, that he goes back to false teachers, but he hasn't really gone back to false teachers. He's been talking about them the whole time through this letter. And so if nothing else, I think we should be, again, still very appreciative of how difficult the false teaching problem had become at Ephesus. So we see, Paul instructing Timothy to beginning by saying, teach and encourage these things. And I think there's cases to be made for both sides. That does teach and encourage these things really refer to what's just been said, or does it apply more to what I'm about to say? And I tend to think it probably refers to more about what he's just said, but I'm okay with either. And I think it's I don't know that it matters all of that much. Again, this is something that we said earlier. And so when he goes into this, if you look beginning in verse 3, if anyone teaches other doctrine and does not agree with the sound teaching of our Lord Jesus Christ and with the teaching that promotes godliness, he's conceited, understanding nothing, but has a sick interest in disputes and arguments over words. From these come envy, quarreling, slander, evil suspicions, and constant disagreement among people whose minds are depraved and deprived of the truth, who imagine that godliness is a way to material gain. So he really opens up this final section with some pretty harsh words, again, for people who are teaching false doctrine. And he's really getting to the heart of their hearts, right? I mean, he's talking, think about how he's describing them. But has a sick interest in disputes and arguments over words. We kind of use that language to describe people that teach, think about today. We talk about the sick interest of certain groups trying to teach our kids about homosexuality, about all of these things that are highly inappropriate for certain age groups. And, that's a term that I think we talk about, that takes a certain level of depravity. And he's using similar language here, talking about their motivation and where their heads are at. And so to teach, to have that kind of mindset, I think also just reinforces what he's talking about false doctrine really being, and that's a perversion. That it is a perversion of the truth, and that it comes about from evil motivations. And he talks about it being a different doctrine, and he gives some example of that motivation that really I think we can boil down into kind of two qualities, and it comes from pride, and it sometimes comes from a place of greed. Or he talks about even that they do it for a reason of material gain, that they sought it as a way to make money. And so, the part for me that's always been difficult on that is I've never heard of somebody saying, hey, the way I'm going to make it big is be a preacher. It's just not something that people, you don't hear. If you hear somebody say, I want to, especially think about a teenager or something, if they got an idea that, hey, I'm going to pick a job that makes me rich, you usually go to something like a doctor or a lawyer or something that takes a lot of school and a lot of training and a lot of specialty and all that, but you don't really hear people at least bragging about setting out to be a preacher or an evangelist to become wealthy. But it certainly does happen. And I think really if we think about, maybe we have to kind of step outside of the church and look at what I'm going to call the religious world as a whole. Now it starts to make a little more sense to me, right? Because we have people who have built vast empires, business empires, based on Christianity, and I'm using that in quotes with only the broadest sense of interpretation that the world understands, that they preach a perverted, different gospel and to that end, they amass great amounts of wealth. So you could certainly see why there probably is some kid out there somewhere thinking, hey, I'm gonna do that, and I'm gonna get a big arena, and I'm gonna have a private jet, and all these things that go with vast amounts of wealth, and so you can certainly see where greed might factor into that as well. And so he says that that was some of their motivation. And so pride, the idea of being puffed up, and then we see the effect that has, especially on the church there. All right, so then he contrasts that with the in verse 6, but godliness with contentment is great gain. You really want great gain. You really want to amass a lot, and he's not saying fortunes in the earthly sense, but pursue godliness. Everything that the false teachers are motivated by deals with worldliness. Everything that he's been talking about to Timothy, directly and indirectly throughout this letter, has dealt with godliness. We've talked about it several times. The word's used 8 different times in this letter that he uses here for godliness. We might translate it piety. And if you think about that idea, everything that we've talked about in terms of honor, respect, value, the things that are important to us go back to that same idea. Pursuing godliness, what is important to me? What is important to you? It needs to be this. It needs to be being godly, living and acting accordingly in the household of God. He touches a little bit on the folly of pursuing worldliness, and then really the downside to what that brings. He mentions envy, strife, railings, evil surmising. He mentioned all that in the previous section, talking about what they brought, and he kind of brings it back with this idea of being content, and he goes back to something very similar to what Job said in verse 7, and that idea is of all the stuff that's in this world, of everything that we amass and we get here, how much or how little, how much of it are we going to take with us? Nothing, right? Nothing. None of this goes with you. None of this, in the grand scheme of things, is important. And again, another theme that we've seen throughout this, we haven't talked about contentment per se, but this idea of things that are spiritual being the more valuable and the only value that we have. The idea of being godly is the only thing of value. Being worldly has absolutely no value in the end. And so, he's I think elaborating here on the necessity of being content with what we have, because it goes hand in hand with godliness. The letter, like I've said before, is so much of this letter is about pursuing that, pursuing God, pursuing His truth, pursuing the proper order that He set for us. Again, I go back to chapter 3 and verses 14 and 15, where He said, I write these things so that you know how to behave, or that you know how to conduct yourself. And so, as Christians, we have to possess the right disposition, one that's with humility, that we're compliant with the authorized Scripture and the Word of God. And so we do that because if widows, if elders, if our masters are worthy of all respect, how much more respect and honor is the Creator worthy of? Okay, and so I think that's the final part of that progression, is that you've got this idea that you've got to honor all of these different positions and institutions in the world that you're navigating, both inside and outside of the church, and you've got obligations and responsibilities, but in the end, we owe everything to our Creator because He's given us everything. And the stuff that's in this world that sustains us through life is not what we're taking with us, but it's the stuff that will sustain us in eternity. And he'll come back to that here in just a second. So he encourages the man of God that he uses that term, talking to Timothy, and again another charge. But he gets down and he gives him a little bit of information as well regarding the rich. And I think that if you think about it, he's just talked about contentment and not being concerned with the things of this world, but he also is acknowledging that there are believers, there are righteous people who have means, and they have, and he gives him the things that they should be concerned with doing with that. And what is that? It doesn't contradict what he's told him at all, right? In fact, it goes exactly with it, because he's told them that with your money, with your riches, they need to, he says, instruct those who are rich in the present age not to be arrogant. So where is your mindset? Arrogance comes from putting your faith in something else, namely yourself, and don't set their hope on the uncertainty of wealth, but on God. So just like everybody else, they're not to focus on worldliness, they're to focus on godliness. And he says in verse 18, instruct them to do what is good, to be rich in good works, to be generous, willing to share. They're supposed to use what they have, right? It doesn't say they're supposed to divest themselves of all of it. What he's saying is that they've been blessed with something, use it. Use it for helping the kingdom, helping your brothers and sisters, helping those who are in need. And so it goes again hand in hand with everything that we've talked about. And he gives them, I think, a little bit of extra insight into how God views that. When those who have used that to do good in this world, that what does that do? What is that effectively doing? He compares it to laying up treasure for themselves in heaven. So when you do it, it's not give a dollar, make a dollar, right? It's when you do these things, when you think this way, when you conduct yourselves like this, God sees that as you being focused on eternity and being focused on what matters. And so it simply is a way to, hey, Timothy, remind them of these things, instruct them, and tell them that, they can do good with what they have. He finally closes it out with another plea or another charge to Timothy. And beginning in verse 20, Timothy, guard what has been entrusted to you, avoiding irreverent, empty speech and contradictions from the knowledge that falsely bears that name. By professing it, some people have deviated from the faith. Grace be with all of you. And so he closes this out talking to Timothy, saying, guard what's been entrusted to you. What had been entrusted? What did Paul entrusted Timothy with? He'd given him this responsibility, go to Ephesus. Go do this and root out the false teachers. Establish these things that I've given you. He gave him, and he's telling Timothy, guard this. Take care of it. Preserve it. Honor it. And do it, right? And so carry it out. And then that final, avoiding irreverent, empty speech and contradictions from, and he uses, my translation has knowledge in quotes. Obviously, Paul's, I think, injecting a little bit of sarcasm here, right? And because that's what they call it, right? They call it knowledge. It's probably, I think, you could probably look at what was going on in the first century with this idea of knowledge and what it was doing to the church. And you think about Gnosticism, and so Paul is really, again, getting back to the idea, though, that there is only one gospel. Anything else is a different gospel. Anything else is a perversion. Any other teacher is a perverted teacher who's doing it for all kinds of wrong reasons. And ultimately, that Timothy, needs to guard this, carry it out, and avoid that. And then he, again, as if we needed another reminder, if Timothy did, but he does. By professing it, he reminds them what happens to those people that do it, and they've deviated from the faith. They've caused others, especially, to leave and to not be in a favorable status with God. All right, I know I really went through that. We got 2 minutes left. If you've got any kind of other comments or observations about this part of Timothy or the book in general. All right, now, the first time, no comments. All right. No, but, I think it's, again, this is a valuable study for us. I think a lot of times we do look at 1 Timothy and it's particularly when we study it with Titus, as where we go for qualifications of elders and deacons, and that's certainly important. But ultimately, I think what we get from especially maybe, even if we didn't start out planning to just do 1 Timothy, and we're certainly going to get 2 Timothy all summer long, which is going to be beneficial to us, I think, but by looking at just this letter, I think one of the things that we take away is that it's real easy to end up being a church like Ephesus and having these kind of problems if we don't understand what we're dealing with, if we don't have a proper appreciation for God's word and for proper doctrine, if we don't have a proper respect for what He said, then why would we have a proper respect for our brothers and sisters, for those in authority, and why would we, in all of this, if our focus is the world and our focus is worldliness, how on earth can we ever hope to be right before God and be godly? How can we live our lives in a way that is pleasing to Him? And the answer is you can't. I mean, they just are incompatible with each other. And so, we can't live one way here and one way, outside, so I think there's just a lot that we can take from this. I do appreciate your comments. I know we've had a good class in terms of participation, and so hopefully you got a little bit out of it, because I certainly got a lot out of it as well. And so we're out of time now, and that is our class.